Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I know that I have not been posting with the regularity as normal. That is due to both the Jewish holidays, the Chagim, and also the beginning of the academic year. But now, once the holidays are beginning to subside, I will get back to my at least once a week posting of interesting conversations, including today's, where I talked to Rabbi Sam Stern, who is a rabbi in Topeka, Kansas. Some may dub him the Chief Rabbi of Kansas. And we have a wide ranging conversation, starting with the trend and rise of rabbis who are actually anti-Zionist in many of the liberal Jewish movements, including Reform, Reconstructionist, and the conservative movement. We have a conversation about this. I ask him how we got here, and we sort of tease out a lot of the insider conversations that are happening inside these denominations. And then we get into about a 30 or 40-minute debate about whether or not Reform Judaism actually has a future. And this was a fascinating debate. I'm very thankful for Sam for being a great interlocutor here. And I also, upon listening back to the podcast, I came across a little bit more hard-hitting than I meant to. And so I very much thank Sam for being a great conversational partner, and I am sure you will all enjoy. And now I bring you Rabbi Sam Stern. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk is because I really love everything about your social media postings. We were chatting offline about that. And one topic that I think you might be in an interesting position to comment on, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, is the rise of rabbis in the non-Orthodox world. So, I'm mostly talking about Reform, although we can probably also talk about the Reconstructionist movement and conservative movement of rabbis that are not just, slightly critical of Israel, but actually anti-Zion. And how did we get here? Meaning, how did we get to a place where, on average, if you look at the graduating class at a HUC on an average campus, or RRC, right, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, how is it the case that, 50 or so percent of the students are not just, okay, they don't like BB or settlements, but they are actually, anti-Zionist, no ifs, ands, and buts?
You know, uh, that's an excellent question. I was ordained from Hebrew Union College only a couple of years ago. This is actually my second career. I started off making a difference in Reform synagogues by working in the youth work world. And when I went to HUC, and again, I was ordained in 2021, uh, at the last APAC conference in 2020, I spoke about the rise of anti-Zionism on campuses. And at that time, at least on my campus of HUC, it was more of a cooling effect. And I warned of the chilling effect that came from not wanting to discuss Israel, not allowing pro-Israel organizations to spread their advocacy, where when you would allow other groups, which with other priorities, whether they, especially when you feel they align with your movement, you'd allow them, and you'd want them to have access to your students, and you'd want them to be represented on your campus. What we found was organizations I wanted to be involved with, like APAC, were not as welcome as organizations like J Street, like Trua, like groups that have their own agendas. And so I think that's how it started, was institutions making choices. Institutions always make choices, I guess. And what evolved from there was, we've also seen in recent years, as Reform Judaism. I can only speak for Reform Judaism as I've seen it. I grew up in Reform Judaism. I've been a lifelong Reform Jew. I grew up outside of DC in Rockville, Maryland, at Temple Beth Ami, which was one of those many thousand plus family congregations in the DC area. And I grew up with a Reform Judaism that was both rigorous and liberal. I mean that rigorous as we were committed to trying to uphold and seize and know as much as we could. We wanted to do mitzvot. We wanted to learn as much as we could. We wanted to be more attached to tradition than previous generations of reform in the 40s and 50s, like classical reform had been. And we were liberal. We were in broadly, and not liberal politically, I don't mean, but liberal. We were open-minded. We were interested in innovation in liturgy and interested in new interpretation. Like it seemed rigorous and interested. in the 2000s, one of the ways we found in youth engagement to engage people more, I swear I'm answering your question, by the way. When
This is
we,
this is what happens when you interview a rabbi. It's
right, exactly. It just goes off the rails, but I'll try and make it quick. What we learned in the 2000s was you could engage more young people through advocacy work than in other ways. And as the movement shifted in that direction, it became more and more primarily focused on social action, social justice. At the same time, as the movement had less money, it seemed it withdrew from areas, it stopped doing some programs it did before. And with the closure of Kutz Camp, which happened as well, various things happened. And that's what happened. Movements, they're big, they're messy. I can certainly understand that. But we kind of hollowed out some things. And what we ended up with was many people who were very interested. But we also have now people who go to rabbinical school because of the change they want to see in the world. They want to, and while there are many versions of the rabbinate, and I'm not saying one is more appropriate or better than another, God forbid. I think there are rabbis, Reform rabbis, conservative rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, rabbis of all kinds that are doing great work in many different settings. But I have a concern when rabbis set out from the beginning wanting to be activists, because especially when I worry that their priority isn't based in what I see as the fundamental values of Reform Judaism, which are pluralism, egalitarianism, and Jewish peoplehood.
So in a couple minutes, I'm going to push you hard on
Yeah.
whether or not there still is a relevance for the Reform movement, given that you're coming off like a pluralist. And so I do think there is a tension there of Reform Judaism not necessarily being a pluralistic movement, but being a specific narrow movement. And what you just described, which I think describes the zeitgeist change in next generation of Jews. You know, I work on campus. I've met probably 2 or 3 Jews across 3 campuses in 9 years that proudly identify as Reform Jews, right? They're Jewish. The synagogue they went to might have been Reform. They might have been bar mitzvah Reform. They might have, you know, half the week's gone to Chabad and half the week's gone to Reform, right? But like this idea that people are self-selecting into a movement based off some top-down creed, right? Like that's very, you know, 19th or maybe 20th century, right? Like that doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to push you on that in a little bit.
Sure.
I wanted to just describe for listeners, because what you're talking about in terms of the Reform movement and Zionism, I'll just give like a little bit of history and then we can talk about the current situation. I mean, the Reform movement has always had a very tenuous relationship with Zionism. And, you know, just to paint the historic contours, Avraham Geiger, who is, you know, considered the father of at least the German Reform movement. I mean, he was obviously existing in a paradigm before political Zionism, but he would have been considered a sort of, you know, proto non-Zionist, right? You know, he was very into Jews staying in whatever country and making that country, you know, strong and prosper, what we might call a diasporic nationalist. He was actually very against this idea of Jewish peoplehood, right? So there was actually this situation that happened in Syria called the Damascus Affairs in 1840, where there was essentially a blood libel perpetuated against the Jewish community in Syria, and much of the Jewish community came to the support of, you know, the Jews falsely accused of you know, baby murder in Syria. And Avraham Geiger actually coached the German Reform movement not to get involved because in his view, Judaism is just a religion. So Jewish people have no actual communal bond between a Jew living in Germany and a Jew living in Syria, right? You know, it's just the same as anybody else living in Syria. And so, you know, then as the Reform movement moves to America, you know, listeners have probably heard of the infamous Pittsburgh platform. That's when the Reform movement officially says, you know, we are no longer a people and we are not a nation, we are a religion. We don't want a return to, you know, our homeland. We don't want, you know, any of the Messianic or any of the Third Temple. Interestingly enough, there was a historian, Jonathan Grivitz. I'm not sure if you've seen this. He wrote an academic article a couple of years ago called the PLO's Rabbi, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, where he traces that the PLO in its founding in the 1960s actually based their understanding of Israel, Jews, and Zionism based off the Pittsburgh platform and the idea that you still see in much of the far left and Islamic world of, well, Jews are a religion. Why do they need a state? That's actually, you know, taken right out of the Pittsburgh platform. Now, obviously, you know, to be fair, in the last 120 or so years, The Reform movement has very much shifted, right, in the interwar period, just like many American Jews after 1920s, right, they sort of hopped on the Zionist bandwagon. But I think the Reform movement in particular has always had this very strange relationship when it comes to Jewish peoplehood and Israel and all of that. And so talk to me, I just threw a lot of things out at you, but,
Yeah.
it is interesting because I've noticed more than any other movement, and I guess this is the problem when you have a movement that is less rooted in tradition and history, is that it's more, movable according to the winds of the time. I mean, if I'm trying to understand the Reform movement's position on something, it seems like it's switched, 3 or 4 times over the last 150 years. And so, I don't know. So I just want to sort of throw that all to you in terms of, the Reform movement's now relationship with Zionism. To me, it makes no sense to have a Jewish leader who is an anti-Zionist, right? It seems almost a
I agree with you.
contradiction. It seems
I
almost
agree
a
with you.
contradiction in terms. And the interesting thing is, yes, the Reform movement was predicated off making Judaism a religion, right, that has certain theologies or dogmas. But the irony is, I know this from most Reform congregants, most of my students, and I would venture to guess the majority of Reform rabbis. If you ask them about very theologic or dogmatic views, many of them would say, listen, I don't have, concrete dogmatic view. No one's pulling out the Pittsburgh platform or Columbus platform as to like, what do you actually believe about the world? But their Jewish interaction is much more community-based or peoplehood-based or cultural-based or history-based, mixed in with some religious element. So the biggest irony I always say about non-Orthodox Jewish anti-Zionists is they say that Judaism's a religion. They don't really practice that religion. And then they say, well, Jews, and it's just an
But you
obvious
don't have to be
contradiction.
right. You don't have to be
Sure.
that religion, right?
Like if you were sitting here and you were a Satmar Chassid and you were an anti-Zionist and you said, listen, Judaism's a religion and our religious values say we shouldn't have a secular state, I obviously disagree, but I actually respect where that position's coming from an intellectual and traditional point of view.
I'm not sure I do, but
No, amazing. I would love to have that conversation in a second.
sure.
But in terms of like the Reform movement, I mean, it almost seems like if somebody is a non-Orthodox rabbi, right, they're not keeping Jewish law, they're not intimately familiar with, the Talmud or medieval Jewish texts or anything like that, and they're also not a part of the dominant project of Jewish peoplehood in the 20th and 21st century. Like, by what metric are they have anything to do with Judaism? Like, I get that they're Jewish, right? So I get a lot of people say,
Absolutely.
oh, well, and so I would love to get your thoughts on that. It seems like there's some you agreed with,
Sure.
some you disagreed with.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, it's really hard to compare. You said it's very hard to compare Reform Judaism across time. Classical Reform Judaism, which is basically what we call pre-1950s Reform Judaism, pre-1960s Reform Judaism, is almost doesn't exist. There are very few places in the world where it still does. It's in this country, it basically doesn't exist. The Reform Judaism now, and you said there's some tension there. What Reform Judaism is a big tent, right? The idea is that it's going to. You say it's not more. Well, it's supposed to be more to Torah, but changeable across time. That's the idea of Reform Judaism. And so it allows interpretation to make modern our tradition. In the best possible circumstance, it does that. That being said, so that's me defending the what reform is in a world that changes. That means, though, we do have to fight, because if all of the Jews who feel one way leave, then there is some general, just like in many Jewish communities across history, if everybody's doing it one way, that becomes the way they do it. So we have to fight for Zionism. In a way, we haven't had to fight for Zionism, I think, in my lifetime. And that is disconcerting and makes me very upset. At the same time, I just want to say it's a fight I don't know. I have not thrown in the towel on. It's a fight I don't think we're going to lose. I think the vast majority of not just my congregants, but congregants and people youth that I worked with when they were growing up, and people from congregations across this country are not necessarily enthralled with, the ivory tower leadership of the Reform movement and its boards, which are limited to the very exclusive groups of people who are in bigger congregations who may have access to more resources. And while we certainly value their input, I'm not certain that it's currently speaking for the reform movement. I think most of our movement is Zionist. And I think the reform movement as anti-Zionist, post-creation of the state, we could have arguments pre-creation of the state about, about the reform movement was anti-Zionist, and yes, they were, and that's bad. I wish they weren't, but I can't change that. At the same time, they were anti-Zionist in a world without a Jewish state. In a world with a Jewish state, there is no argument that can be made for its demolition that doesn't also advocate for the killing of at least a vast majority of the many millions of Jews who live in the state of Israel. So I agree with the premise, certainly, that you said from the outset, that it makes no sense for a Jewish leader to be anti-Zionist. That be a rabbi, that be a synagogue president, that be a federation person, whoever. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. And I have no problem with expressing to members, to people who come to me and they say, I'm an anti-Zionist, I want to convert to Judaism, or I'm an anti-Zionist, I want to do X. I say, I'm sorry, I don't think this is the community for you, because we're Reform and we're Zionist.
Do you think that the rabbinic schools should have a basic litmus test on who they accept based on ideology? Meaning, like, my background is the Orthodox world, which, if you go to any yeshiva, it doesn't even matter if you want to be a rabbi or not. Like, it's assumed you're going to keep kosher and Shomer Shabbat and all of these things. And so, obviously you have to be dating and marrying someone Jewish. And one of the things that, the reform world, again, is this a design or is this a bug, right? It's sort of, unclear, but, in their antinomian character, again, I'm saying that descriptively, not normatively, right? The idea is that, well, you don't necessarily have to keep any specific Jewish traditions or facets of Jewish law. And, I might add, you might not even have to have any specific belief. So I imagine, a lot of people, if you ask them in the reform movement, in the rabbinic schools, they would say, well, they're complicated views of God, or maybe they're agnostic, or maybe, all of that. But,
doesn't make us sound great. I got to be honest. I certainly hope everyone at HUC can say they believe in God. I certainly believe in God.
Sure. But I would guess that we both know that that's probably not the reality.
Not everyone,
which again, might be fine. But I guess the question I would pose is, should there be any ideologic minimum that, if you are getting a rabbi, to work at a Hillel, let's say, that is from the reform movement, okay, at least this person is X, right? And the sort of issue is, it seems like that answer is increasingly becoming no. Meaning, if I meet somebody who is a non-Orthodox rabbi, right, I can go broad and not just pick on the reform movement. And again, I say this as a non-Orthodox rabbi, right? Like, I have left the Orthodox world and can defend that decision. And if you were an Orthodox rabbi, I would be attacking from the exact opposite way. So it's just all part of the fun. Right? Like, I don't know what that person's Shabbat practice looks like. I don't know if that person keeps kosher. I don't know if that person has a deep knowledge of, classical Jewish texts. You cringed on that before, so we can, go down that rabbit hole in a second. I don't know if that person has a commitment to the Jewish, state / the Jewish peoplehood national project. So, like, the only thing I know about that person is that, like, some group that represents a small facet of the American Jewish community, like, decided that this person is a rabbi and a Jewish leader. But, like, I think that's becoming increasingly problematic in a pluralistic Jewish space, where the reality is, unlike the 1960s and 70s, when there'd be one large Reform synagogue in a giant suburb and everybody would go there, like, it's just not the case anymore, right? There's Chabads popping up in every block. The Orthodox community is making extreme inroads with things like, Aish and Kiruv movements and all of these things. And also just pluralistic institutions are rising. So the rise of things like, Moishe House and Hartman and Hadar and Pardes and, and so there's a lot of real challenges here that I'm afraid that, it's not even just a question of, the leadership in the reform world. It just seems like it's like the movement. And again, please defend, please push back. But it just seems like the relevance is dwindling with every, non-action by leadership.
Well, you've asked me to defend the reform movement, and what I can always do reliably and faithfully is defend Reform Judaism. The Reform movement, however, I don't feel is comfortable always defending, and I don't think in this particular case I want to. I phrase it often as you mentioned, there used to be just people would go to the Reform synagogue. It was the big synagogue and people would go. That's called sitting on a lead in sports, in the sports world. And we've been sitting on the same lead for 40 years now, 30 years about, as we've removed things and canceled things and removed planks. You asked me before about litmus tests from schools. I think, and as someone whose smicha comes from HUC, I certainly want that smicha to be worth something in the future. And there can be concern when you don't know what you're getting in a rabbi, that the quality will drop. Now, I believe that HUC, and I say this with no offense to you or any other rabbi that's come from any institution of any movement, I believe that for the last 50 years, by and large, HUC has been the preeminent school of training American rabbis. I say that because American rabbis have many jobs. In addition to, I do hope they will be faithful students of the text. I took classes, we tried to get people to take classes, across in LA between Ziegler and HUC to try and engage further with our Torah learning. We certainly want people to be deeply well-rounded in their textual education, but we also train them to do many other things, from pastoral care to community leadership to fundraising to any number of things that make up the modern American Jewish experience. So while I do believe that it has been the best place, I am concerned because if we're going to train people who are not committed to, as you said, the major Jewish national project, then it raises a lot of doubts about the rest of that, about what else we're not training rabbis to do. And I certainly believe that we're still training rabbis the way we ought to be training them. But I'm concerned and believe we should have various litmus tests, including for Zionism at HUC.
I mean, even the idea, a litmus test, has sort of a negative connotation, but just, the basic idea that if you are training to become a Jewish leader, you are committed to Jewish projects, such as, history and peoplehood and all of these things. It just seems so obvious in some sense. I want to now push you, I guess, from the
Sure.
other side. I see the future of American Judaism as a staunchly non-denominational one. I think I would bet almost anything that when our children and grandchildren are, on Zoom calls together recording, podcasts, when my grandson takes this up from me in 50 years, they'll be talking about some relic of the American Jewish past in the 20th century and early 21st century of, denominational life that was then supplanted by the rise of post-denominational / pluralistic / non-denominational institutions, just because of the way that people identify for so many obvious reasons. I think Chabad has really thrown a wrench, and, it used to be that the Orthodox movement was content on being insular, and insularity was a feature, not a bug. In other words, the reason why, I always quote this with students, they're always shocked. Chabad is not the biggest Hasidic movement in
Right.
America or Israel. It's Satmar. You've never met a
Right.
Satmar Jew. I've never met a Satmar Jew, right? The reason why is because they precisely keep themselves insular. Right. But now Chabad, with their specific brand of kiruv and outreach, right, they're sort of throwing a wrench into that. The number of Jews that I've met, whether when I worked in a Reform synagogue as a rabbi or at Hillel, people even who grow up Reform, they've all interacted with Chabad and had a different flavor of Judaism and everything there. Not to mention, again, Gen Zers and millennials, we don't like to be put into boxes. So if someone asks, what are you in terms of a Jewish denomination? Most people say, well, it's complicated. I grew up in X, Y, or Z synagogue. I may have gone to a, Camp Ramah, but I'm just Jewish, right? Not to mention, just one more thing, as somebody who is married to a non-Ashkenazi woman, right? It's a very Ashkenazi, centric thing, this whole,
Absolutely true. Absolutely
denominations.
true.
And, I think, with the Persian community and Israeli community and Syrian community, Reform Judaism might as well to them be, Zoroastrianism, right? In terms of, right, there's just no ability to comprehend what is happening there, even as a lot of their actual practice of Judaism might more closely mirror a Reform communities in terms of, driving on Shabbat and using phone and things like that. But like in terms of the,
But working in Shabbat and Havdalah and other
sure,
things into
sure.
your
But just in
weekly,
terms of
yeah,
the
yeah,
construct about it. So
I
I'm,
agree
I'm
with
sort
you.
of curious how you see this, the future of these denominations and American Jewish life and all of that.
I agree with you that at the moment we're moving towards this post-denominationalism. I don't think that that's necessarily bad. I'm a committed pluralist, and I really think that it may end up in the future being the best. I point a lot to what Isaac Mayer Wise that at the beginning of Reform Judaism in America, the purpose was not specifically to make a Reform Judaism in America. It was originally, or Wise's project was, of course, to create Minhag America and to try and create in the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which became the URJ, an actual union of all American Jewish Hebrew congregations, which included the Orthodox, which, of course, we couldn't all get along at that point, and that became a dividing point. But the purpose was to create one pluralistic, one modern for the late 19th century Judaism that fit in this unique context. And I understand there's a lot more history there that we don't have time to get into, but I say that it may not be the worst thing if we were to move in a less denominational direction. But Reform Judaism is at the moment, assuming that if that doesn't happen, because things go in phases, right? And people, sometimes the culture is more this way, sometimes it's more that way. Right now, everyone's liking their, and Chabad is great. I've got a great relationship with the Chabad rabbi nearby. They're good too. I'm not dishing anyone, but people go back and forth in what they like and what they think is authentic and what they think matches their label for that week. And this week they don't like labels, but sometime they might again. I'm not saying that's a plan, but at the same time, Reform Judaism, if it doesn't want to go the way of, if it doesn't want to face dissipating into Hevel, then it has to fight for it. It has to reinvent itself. It really needs to come up with some new ideas, to present something for the American conversation. For a long time, Reform Judaism drove people to Judaism, and we can discover that again, or we can move into post-denominationalism. Personally, as a pluralist, I'll be happy with either.
Well, here's actually how I think about it. I'm curious if you agree or disagree. I actually have a lot of respect for Avraham Geiger, aside from the whole, Damascus affair thing that I said before,
right, yeah,
but
except for that, which we don't have any right.
no, but listen, I actually totally get what he was trying to do. And I've actually, because when I talk with a lot of Orthodox friends of mine, people who say Mendelssohn and Avraham Geiger were, he's not considered a positive figure in the Orthodox world, but I endlessly defend them because I say, listen, in Germany in the 1700s with Mendelssohn or the 1800s with Geiger, the status quo, society push for a young educated Jew in Germany was to assimilate and even convert to Christianity. I mean, that was just the, natural, and so Geiger, one way of viewing his project was saying, okay, some amount of assimilation and acculturation is inevitable, right? Putting aside the question of whether or not it's desirable, a priori or not, but it's inevitable. And so we need to create something that allows Jews to do what they're inevitably going to be doing, integrating into German society, even speaking German, God forbid, and not Yiddish, all of these things, while creating some stopgap of saying, Judaism can retain relevance and you don't need to be a Protestant to be a deep religious thinker. And so, he was trying to give Jews a way out of their particularism to embrace universalism, still under the branches and guise of Judaism. Today, in the 21st century, what I see is the exact opposite is necessary. In other words, now, when I talk to most young people, they are in this, what I call postmodernist soup of lack of identity in America in the 21st century, right? Like everyone is a universalist.
Yeah.
everyone, I don't mean literally everyone, but everyone's a liberal.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone is, all ideas are great and, all cultures are great, right? Like, again, I'm being a little bit cynical, but in a real sense, I think many of the problems facing young Jews today is not that they are feeling shackled by their Jewish identity to entering into the American mainstream. They've made it into the American mainstream, and now they're dealing with the general myopia of, now what? What is my
Yeah.
identity? Who am I? Right? People
Now
are
they're
lonely.
lost.
Yeah, they're lost. And so now we need the exact opposite of Geiger, reform. We need to take the universalistic identities and say, hey, 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 you are part of this very specific particularistic heritage called
Yeah.
Judaism. And what I've seen, and one of the, my most hard hitting, I think, in my head, criticism for the reform movement is actually not about Zionism or HUC or the schools. It's and I think on the flip side, it speaks to the success of Chabad is recognizing this, that the way to actually attract young Jews and what young Jews actually need now is a lot of particularism. And from what I've seen, again, this might be a stereotype, you'll push back if it is, but this talk of, well, Judaism's mostly about social justice and tikkun olam and liberalism, it's just not what people need now, right? It's not helpful because they can get that
Right.
anywhere, right? Like you go to campus and you get talks of social justice. You go to Shabbat dinner, you want Jewish particularism. You don't want a reproductive rights Shabbat or an LGBTQ Shabbat. I mean, maybe those things are good values, maybe not, right? That can be a separate
Some of them
conversation.
want, some people want, but yeah, yeah, yeah.
But you want Shabbat themed Shabbat, right? I always joke to my students, they're like, "What's this theme of Shabbat going to be this week?" I'm like,
We do
"Same as every
Shabbat,
week.
right?
It's Shabbat themed Shabbat, right? Like we don't need to add another theme to like So that's that But I wonder almost if the reform movement, given its foundation both in Germany and America, being rooted in this attempting to embrace the mainstream and the universalism and everything there, if it's equipped to making this shift that I think is relevant for survival in terms of re-embracing a lot of the, you know, people-centric, narrow, right?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, I think it absolutely is. And I agree with you. I think, just like I was mentioning earlier, that we leaned especially hard in the early 2000s into universalism and social justice. I don't think the leadership has changed much since that time. And so if you follow if you follow Reform Judaism online, you will, that's what you're going to see. You're still, it's still 2011. But at the same time, I do, first of all, I do agree with you. I think we're entering a moment in which, in order to move our people out of this miasma, out of the loss that they've lost some of their identity because of the success of the Jewish people in America, right? I mean, it's not just Reform Judaism that did it. Why did people why were people driven to Reform, right? We didn't give them money or cookies. They came to Reform because it fit their life and because American Jews had succeeded to a point that it allowed them to have both things. What we need to do is get back to the education we used to do, to get back to understanding that we are a particular people with a particular mission. And that the Jewish people, we need to get back to focusing on, as you said, Jewish things. We need to do Shabbat themed Shabbats. We need to focus on engaging our people in education so that they're more informed on liturgy and text and tradition. And we can do these things, but it will require, if Reform Judaism wants to do them, instead of individual rabbis out here, and I know of many rabbis in Reform, Conservative. I don't really know Reconstructionist rabbis. And again, they always tell me, people come to me, they say, "Oh, the rabbis for ceasefire, you're evil Reform people." And I go, I don't know any Reform. Like, I know like 4 Reform people in in that. And I don't know. I don't know where they all come from. But I think I see a lot of rabbis out there of all movements doing really good particularism work. And I think I agree that's the direction we need to be moving. And I think Reform Judaism can help lead American Jews there. But someone in Reform Judaism would need to want to do that.
Let's talk about American politics a little bit. You're obviously in Kansas. How's that for a non sequitur?
No,
Moving
it's
along the
great.
topics. No, so I mean, one, most Jews are obviously, coastal people. And, obviously
Yeah.
there's some Jewish pockets in the Midwest, but, Kansas seems to be off a lot of people's radar. So, you can kind of bring in your experience as being the rabbi in Kansas in a little bit. But, there's also been this embrace of, I'll say, the entire liberal Jewish community, so anyone who's not Orthodox, of just general progressive politics. And, I think October 7th did a lot to like muddy that relationship. But you are, quite outspoken about, American politics as well. And not really
Sure.
an extreme position, but being, a good natured centrist of being willing to criticize any and all sides. So, talk to me about where you see that vantage point. Because one of the criticisms that I often hear about the reform movement is that it's just, the Jewish wing of the Democratic Party. I'm sure you've heard that too. And
Yeah.
again, the Reform movement, has the Religion Action Center, which kind of explicitly is that. But, so talk to me about that. Is that changing the Reform movement? I mean, if somebody who was, say, a outward Trump supporter enrolled in a Reform rabbinic institution, I mean, how would they be treated and everything there?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that exactly. Although we've had people who voted for Trump who were ordained from Hebrew Union College. Certainly, I know them. I think generally it's best, and this is going to sound hypocritical. Generally, it's best rabbis, I think, avoid American politics because of how um, difficult it is to engage with and keep any level of um, I'm not even sure the word propriety, maybe.
Just
um,
to just to push back, because
discipline.
I feel the
Yeah.
same way when it's funny because I obviously because I also teach at UC Irvine. I'm friends with a lot of
Mhm.
professors, and there's this phenomenon where you have, social movements that happen or political movements. And then I talk to political science professors and they say, well, I'm uncomfortable commenting publicly about this socio-politic phenomenon. And I'm thinking, hey, if the people that our society, pays and, elects, again, not really by voting, but, elects to be the keepers of wisdom of
Yeah.
politics, and they are not commenting on politics, like what is their value? I kind of see the same thing for rabbis, meaning you have a community of people who look up to you as a wise inheritor of Jewish tradition. And if we believe Jewish tradition is something to help us gauge and, springboard our thinking on, you know, hopefully we both agree with
Absolutely.
that. And so, it's almost a shame when rabbis recede and say, well, I'm not going to comment at all about the thing that everybody's thinking of. Now, that's different than you showing up to shul and handing out, lawn signs saying, vote Harris or vote Trump, right? I
Agreed.
think that's
Agreed.
beyond the line. But I do think there's some nuance in the
There
politics from the pulpit.
absolutely is some nuance. There is a lot of nuance there. And so while that's general advice I give, as I was about to say, I appreciate you giving that framing because it makes me feel a lot less disingenuous. Because I do engage pretty regularly, at least as you mentioned, on social media with politicians and with politics. And I have good relationships here in Kansas with our elected officials. But I think when you have a well-rounded view of things, you have an obligation to try and present anyone who will listen to you with the correct view of the world, with the honest truth as you can present it to them. And I try my best to call balls and strikes. I try my best to weigh in when people lie, when people misrepresent, when people they want to besmirch others. They want to besmirch Israel, especially. I've had I didn't do much on social media before October 7th. I had maybe 1,000 followers that were all made up of people I went to high school and college with and whatnot. And after October 7th, I couldn't stop myself from sharing not just what Israel was feeling, not just sharing what was going on there, but sharing everything I could. And this is how it started, everything I could that seemed to be I wanted to be a clearinghouse for the best information, for true information, for what was really happening. And as time went on, I continued trying to express that what many, even my congregants, come to me and they say the media says that Israel is doing X. They're starving people, they're genociding, they're doing all of the worst things that carry the most moral weight in all of the world. And I had to respond to that. And I didn't just want to respond to it to the couple hundred people that are listening to me here in Topeka. I am the Rebbe of Topeka as much as there is one. There are no other synagogues here in the capital of Kansas. So it's our show. But even that,
I'm going to introduce you as the Chief Rabbi of Topeka. That
there you go.
sounds,
The Topeka Rebbe is what my friend.
there we
No,
go.
I'm just kidding. Anyway, yeah, so I wanted to have more of an impact than that. I wanted to at least share what I was thinking with more people. I started to write. I started to put it in a couple of featured things in the Times of Israel. I really wanted to express love and support for Israel and its people at such a terrible time. And I did it in every possible venue and way I could think of. And even if that was more political than some people think we should be, I'm out here trying to represent the Reform Rabbinate in the best way I can. And the best way I can think of to represent the Reform Rabbinate is to be pluralist and egalitarian, but also to be particularist and to be a committed lover and supporter of Israel.
I love that. To go in the weeds a little bit on Reform Judaism, because I feel, just like you ask, two Jews and you get three opinions, you also ask two Reform Jews and you get three opinions. Given the amount that the Reform Jewish identity has shifted over the last, 200 years, and, from political advocacy around Zionism to, levels of traditionalism. I mean, I was talking to another good friend who's a Reform rabbi of mine who works for Hillel, and he said that, it would have, that in the contract of many rabbis in the mid-20th century at Reform synagogues, the rabbi were not allowed to wear a talit and kippah, right? Because that was considered too traditional. And now you go to a Reform synagogue on Shabbat, and I would be shocked if the rabbi wasn't wearing a talit and kippah. So even, standards change and everything there. How would you define, I mean, it's sort of a, funny question, but like, how would you define Reform Judaism?
And you're mentioning these changes. I was just thinking about and we do here we'll do a minyan club where we'll wrap tefillin, and we do that. We teach our kids in the bar and bat mitzvah program to wrap tefillin. So, it's like I think there are many of us that see Reform Judaism as the way to bring Judaism into the modern world. And for me, that means I want to bring all of Judaism into the modern world. I don't just want to bring, bar mitzvahs and high holy days into the modern world. Or I don't want to just bring two things that you're going to do, your wedding or something, into them. I want to bring all of it with us. And that includes much larger swaths of tradition than we've always done, but that's a growing thing we've seen over the years. You mentioned in the 50s, they said, oh, you couldn't wear a tallis. It's true. They didn't want to do that. Even in the 70s and 80s, you didn't really see it so much. But by the 90s and 2000s, every Reform synagogue had a repository for talitot and kippot at the front of the sanctuary. So how did that happen? It happened because Reform Judaism decided it wanted to be more attached to tradition. It wanted to be more particular. And it can make that choice again, but it will take some bravery from those who lead us to push in a new direction, a direction that I agree with you we desperately need.
There's a criticism by, I think it was a conservative rabbi, and, listeners can fact check and, maybe or you'll know offhand, who was said in a speech once, and I've been wrestling with this idea, and I can give you why I actually might not agree with what I'm about to say, but I would like to hear you first, who said, the problem with Reform Judaism isn't that they're advocating for change, it's that they're making change sacred. The argument would go like, listen, as long as there were Jews, we can go back to temple times, we can go back to rabbinic times, we can talk about medieval Spain, right? Like, there were Jews who were practicing in a whole variety of ways, and Jews who were more ritually lax. And, this idea that, many Orthodox Jews want to propagate that throughout all of history, all Jews were eating only kosher and keeping Shabbat. I mean, you open the Talmud and these rabbis are visiting prostitutes, right? Like, so clearly something is going on there that's not, the sort of a sanitized version of history that certainly I got growing up in an Orthodox community talking about Jewish history. But that was all done with this idea that, okay, but there still is an ideal in Judaism, and that ideal is represented by holding fast to all of the laws of the Torah and tradition in its most traditional form. Now, of course, I don't believe there's been more than a couple hundred Jews, in all of medieval Spain that opened up Maimonides' Mishnah Torah and actually followed it word for word. Like no chance. I think it's actually a last 150-year thing as a reaction to reform that the Orthodox community became increasingly anal, I'll use a non-academic term, about, every last jot and tittle of Jewish law, not to say there wasn't anybody doing it before, but that's very much, a modern thing. And, you can kind of see glimpses of that, again, when you look at communities like, I just know the LA Persian community, the best out of any community. And this is a community that was untouched by the Enlightenment and the Haskalah. And it's a community that, again, in Israeli, we'd call them Masorati. They're deeply traditional. And it's an interesting counterbalance to reform, because what a reform Jew would say is, we are going to use a PowerPoint on Shabbat because this is enhancing our Shabbat. And so this is actually a positive value that we are, proud of, and we can defend this Jewishly. What your average, say, traditionalist or Masorati would say is, we know it's not okay to use a computer on Shabbat. We're going to do it anyway because, listen, it's the modern world. Of course, we're not going to go 25 hours without, using our phones. I can imagine this hypothetical person. But at the end of the day, we know that that's not the sort of right way to do it. And I'm curious how you think of these two.
So I have a question for you. Is the second one more authentic, or what makes the second one? I'm just curious. What makes the second better than the first? If they're both going to do the same thing, I'm just curious. What makes them different? Besides that, one is saying I'm sinning, oh well, and the other one is saying I don't actually think I'm sinning. Is that the problem? Is that the
No, I think the problem is, and again, I'm not even giving a moral descriptor, because in my personal practice, I might actually be closer to the first in terms of how I think about Judaism. So it'd be ironic.
Too.
So it would be ironic if I said, this is terrible view. But I do think sociologically, from a community standpoint, what gives the second, I think, more sociologic lasting power, not in terms of individual moral choices and what makes sense for that individual, is you hold fast to a foundation that's less subjected to, again, the winds of time changing it. And so, you do feel a lot more firm-footed and secure, even if at the end of the day, a Persian Jew and a Reform Jew are going to be both getting in their car on Shabbat, using their phone, yes, making Kiddush and Havdalah or whatever, to observe Shabbat, but then, spending their Saturdays at the beach or at the mall. At the end of the day, one has a solid foundation to fall back on, whereas, and I've spoken about pluralism many times on the podcast, and, I have sort of a similar gripe with pluralism, even though I'm a pluralist. Again, it was funny. I always, this is like
we are.
No, well, this is a total non sequitur. So I spent obviously years of my life in the Orthodox world. And so everything that I published and talked about at the time was like only a criticism of Orthodox Judaism. And at some point I realized that my criticism was now only levied at the liberal Jewish community. And then it dawned on me, it's because I identified with that community, right? So it's like, I totally am always a, what is my community doing? I want to criticize that type person. So it's just always been my personality, much to the chagrin of any co-person in any community as me. But I think at the end of the day, it allows for a much more, robust fallback plan. Whereas in the non-Orthodox Jewish community, what I often see is, if a student is trying to figure out, what a Shabbat practice looks like, and this is the example I always give, and they come to me and my answer is, well, there's a bunch of different ways to practice Shabbat. What's relevant to you? And then they come to Rabbi Sam and you say, here are a couple ways that I practice Shabbat. And that student's now been given 7 different frameworks of Shabbat, right? One that's just not conducive to a community. And yeah.
I was just going to say, I first of all, whenever someone comes to me with a Jewish question, my first answer is always the traditional answer. I like to try and give the Orthodox answer if I can. I like to try and teach those who disagree with me before myself.
So I have come to that conclusion also, but I want to highlight that, and I want to push back, not from my perspective, but from a perspective that I have gotten whenever I've said that and pushing back. And, why? Like, I mean, it's not...
I give... when I say Orthodox, I mean from the basis of halacha. So it doesn't necessarily have to be with what some Orthodox rabbi today says, but what I give them will likely be what the Orthodox community does because it'll be based on halacha. That's a more specific answer to the question. The reason I do that is because I think halacha is something that should guide us. It's the path. I don't have any problem. I don't have any problem with interpreting halacha where necessary. But I don't have any problem with referencing halacha as it's been in any particular time or any particular decision. And I think it's worth teaching people. After all, that's how we come to these decisions. We reference decisions of rabbis past. And so I like to give them a basis to make an informed choice from. So I will generally teach them the halachic answer. I will then teach them what I do, which will be somewhat similar to what the mainstream Reform would have done 20 years ago, although it's not very similar to what Reform does today. We don't change Kaddish to add V'im Kol Yoshvei Tevet. We don't do any of that. It's all well, it's not traditional liturgy, as you well know, but it's closer, I would say, to what
But
it
we're
was.
actually doing a disservice. So
Yeah.
on the liturgy change,
Yeah.
there's a beauty. I'm traveling to Europe next week with my family, and we're planning on going to Shul in Vienna. I don't speak, any European language. I know 100% that I will be able to 100% follow along with the service.
Yeah.
The reality is that's just not true, right? This is why the argument of the Mizrahi Jewish community, I think comes in with the communal focus. I've been to, several Reform synagogues for different Shabbatot, and it is a completely different service. I mean, even in the Mishkan Tefillah, there is two different versions. I mean, I still can't navigate my way, around Mishkan Tefillah comfortably, and I've, led services with it, in some capacity for many years because it's like clunky. There's multiple versions. There's two different complete versions, and then there's, different choices. And many
Very
Reform
true.
synagogues don't even hold to the Mishkan Tefillah, so they'll, it's like other songs that aren't in there, and you're just like, what is going on here? As opposed to saying, okay, listen, we have a traditional framework. And okay, say you're uncomfortable with the idea of one day there being a third temple and there being animal sacrifices, which is 50% of all prayers in, the Jewish siddur, right? It's the Musaf prayer. It's a lot. So do what Jews have been doing for thousands of years. Don't change the text, but reinterpret. Meaning, like, this is another, I think, things that grinds my gears. And this is kind of what I was saying with the, making the change sacred. The rabbis of the Talmud, we're reformists. I mean, when I teach them historically, it's sort of obvious. They're taking this entire tradition from temple-centric, Jerusalem-centric. They're clearly uncomfortable with a whole host of things the Torah says. Who isn't?
Yeah, you're literally reforming it.
And they they quite literally reinterpret it to the extent where, the rabbis even admit this, right? They understand what they're doing. My favorite is they say that the laws of Shabbat are like mountains held up by strings, right? What do they mean by that? Is they're admitting, the Torah gives, it just says rest on Shabbat, and the rabbis construct hundreds of pages of what exactly that means. But what they're not doing in a whole host of things that make them feel uncomfortable about, I recently did a podcast about the death penalty. So one of the things the rabbis famously do is they litigate the death penalty out of existence in the Talmud. The rabbis don't say, well, we're going to rewrite our versions of the Torah to actually say, you should kill the murderer, to no, you should have mercy on the murderer and not, legislate the death penalty. And so I feel like, by changing the liturgy, and this is, I guess can be equally an attack against the conservative and Reconstructionists, it just seems like it's taking away an opportunity for reinterpretation that. And it's also just creating, 100 different versions of Jewish community to the point where if somebody grows up in a Reform community, there's just no ability for them to join any other Jewish community without an enormous amount of, a threshold for them to overcome.
I do think if someone grows up in a Reform community, it's not quite as hard as you describe. It's kind of like learning to type when you're a kid versus later. If you grow up in it, it kind of makes a little more sense. That being said, I agree.
Sorry, I'm not talking about that congregation specific liturgy. I'm saying if you grow up at a Reform synagogue in New York and then you move to Los Angeles and you join another Reform synagogue, there is a chance that it is just a different service.
There is a chance, but as long as they're using, I agree and disagree a little bit about some of it. I agree we need one siddur across our movement, and I agree that it should be more based in traditional liturgy than interpretation. The new Israeli siddur is a little better in this way. It's Tfilat Ha'adam, the Israeli Reform siddur, sorry. It's a little bit better. I like it a lot, but it does do some interpretation through, liturgical. We prefer to call it liturgical innovation, I think. But I actually don't have a problem with innovating in liturgy. I want to keep traditional liturgy traditional, but I don't have a problem with creating new things or alternative readings and stuff like that. I want
No,
people
listen,
to, yeah.
there's
So yeah,
always been additions, meaning, one
sure,
obvious
yeah,
example, in every Orthodox, not every, in a lot of Orthodox synagogues, they now add a prayer for the state of Israel, right?
sure.
That's obviously a new addition. They weren't doing that in Hungary in the 1800s for obvious
No, of
reasons.
course, yeah.
But they're not changing the Amidah in Musaf to say, well, now that we have a state of Israel, we no longer want to return to Zion, but just now a rebuilding of the temple, right? Like the liturgy stays the same with some additions that then,
Well, there's
there's
some
always been
nice
additions.
things too. I would say it's interesting. Like, um, I like in the Israeli Reform Siddur the changes. In the Amidah, we change just returning God's presence to Zion in the Chatima, but we change it to blessed is God who returns God's people, who returns God's presence and God's people. His people return to Zion. And so it's a very interesting. I think there are very interesting things that can be done. I don't have a problem with that. I actually think this is part of the challenge of educating, and I don't know. I guess I'm flummoxed only because I the liturgy part of it I actually think is beautiful, that it's a little bit different in a lot of places, but I don't want to change traditional liturgy. I'm with you on that, and unfortunately in too many places in some places we have, and I use it. We not so much changes but omissions, right?
But it seems
Mishkan
like
Tefillah has omissions
yeah,
that I deal with, that I'm okay
it,
with.
see, this
Meanwhile,
is not turning into a gripe session here.
Sorry.
No, no, no. I'm saying from my perspective, the what a lot of people will say, and again, I'm sort of half my life is in the liberal Jewish community, half my life is in the Orthodox community, and the Orthodox community just has a stereotype that it's not different, it's less. And I usually push back against that, but let me hold up that argument for a second.
Okay.
At every Reform synagogue I've gone to at Shabbat during the Torah service, this isn't they are reading like maybe 10 verses total in 3 aliyot. And, yes, I get that there was at one time a triennial. Yes, the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud also had a, triennial that they were playing around with. But like, this isn't, at some point it becomes less, we are doing this for different ideological reasons, and more just, this really is just a watered down version of like a traditional service, right? Like there's no liberal reason why one would only read 10 verses out of Torah in
No,
3
I mean,
aliyot on Shabbat.
I don't, I agree. Where I agree, I disagree that it's watered down in general. I think where I agree is that we certainly I mean, we should do all the aliyot we're supposed to do for each given holiday. And we try to, I can't speak to what every synagogue does or what all Reform synagogues do as far as their Torah services and stuff. I think in some cases, it certainly is less. I think there are times when less is good and times when less is bad. I agree with you that it's bad when the less comes in cutting out Torah, which hearing the Torah chanted is a big reason why Jews want to come to synagogue. That's really great. And we should do the full thing. That being said, like repetitions and stuff, you got me. It's less. I didn't do it. I didn't repeat the Amidah. You got me.
But the
We did it all
repetition is when
together once.
the
Yeah.
repetition is when you go find your friend and ask him how his week was and talk about sports and talk about politics. And
Baruch
like, no,
Hashem,
like,
it sounds wonderful, my friend. But we're here doing this, and this is where I say it's interesting because my congregants, especially congregants who grew up Reform and have been Reform Jews their whole lives, would say, "You say that, but I want to get through the Amidah, and then I want to I want to hear the Torah, and I want to hear the sermon, and then I want to go kibitz with my friend at Oneg afterward." Like, we do our kibitzing, we just do it at a different time. Like, it's all, you know what I mean? We're trying, in the best version of it, we're doing. I think there are plenty of people doing Reform Judaism in a way that is both, as I mentioned at the beginning, the way I grew up, that is both rigorous and liberal. Um, I can't, it's like, I mean, you're not doing this, but like, it reminds me of, I talk to people online and they'll say to me things like, the bar mitzvahs and stuff. And I'm like, I can't control what a random person, like I can't control what a random person chooses to do. And if they belong to a Reform synagogue, then it's on me. I usually like to say Reform synagogues, much like Chabad in many ways, I think, maybe the only way we're just like them. We have a lot of secular people that attend. Um, there are Reform Jews and there are secular Jews. I agree with you. If you just counted Reform Jews in this country, there'd be a lot fewer than the members of our congregations. But being a Reform Jew means something. It means something above and beyond being a secular Jew. And too often in our culture and in the Jewish community, these two terms are deemed equivalent. That Reform equals secular, and that we're watering things down, we're making it less. I would say in no way when Reform is now, again, I don't know what every rabbi is doing. There are more Reform synagogues than any other synagogue in this country, and more of our synagogues are small. 80% of our synagogues are these small, like mine, that are under 300 family units. So there are a lot of synagogues out there. There are over 1,000 Reform synagogues in America. I don't know what each one does. I have confidence that my colleagues are doing their best to present a rigorous and liberal form of Judaism. That being said, there are people who don't do things. I mean, like in any movement, in any group of people, in any rabbinic organization, maybe an Orthodox organization wouldn't struggle with only doing 3 aliyot. Maybe none of their rabbis, that would be a problem. But there may be other things as well. I think that in the end, Reform Judaism has a future if it wants to grasp it. And the question will be, does Reform Judaism want that? If we just want to be the old people who are eventually fading away, we can do that. And younger Reform rabbis will move into the pluralistic lane, and that's what we'll do. I personally don't hope that's what's going to happen, but it's one possibility. Another possibility is, of course, we get new leadership with new direction, and our movement chooses to try and adapt to the 21st century the way I think the Reform movement ought to do. I'm talking about being in people's homes. I'm talking about presenting a vision of Jewish life that's both modern and part of their neighbors' lives, and also that involves every aspect of Jewish ritual. And I think that's doable. I honestly do. And maybe it's not, but I'm an optimist.
We've been talking for a while, so is there
Yeah,
any other points or anything, I know we've sort of, meandered around here, but is there any point you wanted to
absolutely.
like go back to, any
Yeah,
thing
I
you
think
wanted to
just for sure. I think on Israel, I think there's a lot of especially younger rabbis that are really trying to be as we're moving past the whole boomer Gen X control of society, as everyone's aging up, I think we're seeing a new generation of rabbis especially in the Reform movement rise, who are deeply committed to particularism, to Jewish peoplehood, and to Zionism. I'm a member of something called the Amplify Israel Rabbinic Fellowship. It's a project of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City. And they have brought together now over 2 and soon to be 3 cohorts, some of the best, most articulate, leading young Reform rabbis in this country to work on ways to make their Zionist voice, their advocacy for Israel, and their support for Jewish peoplehood louder, and give them new platforms. And that's something that I've been learning about. I've had the opportunity to work on my writing so that I can get published more places, so I can move a little bit away from social media and get more into the opinion influencing space. And I've seen so many other people get that opportunity. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that, because that's a big reason why my voice has taken such a lift.
That's amazing. No, I mean, I really appreciate your voice. I would, definitely recommend that, people follow you on Twitter, which, I've
Thank you. At
been,
Rabbi Sam Stern on Twitter. Absolutely. You can follow me there.
and, listen, if you ever make it out to California, we got to get lunch or coffee in person, but I appreciate the
Absolutely.
conversation. Thank
Sounds
you.
great. Thank you
Amazing. Well,
so much for having me also.
yeah,
Thank you
thank you
very
so much
much.
for coming.
Absolutely.